What does failure of a man Carl Benjamin and the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist have in common? We'll find out later. Not to be confused with the popular punk haunt of a similar name, CPGB-ML is Britain's #1 communist party. Or so they say. Now a little bit of backstory, CPGB-ML, or CPGB for syllable's sake, or CP, whatever you want to call them, began in 2004 as a split from the Socialist Labour Party ran at the time by Arthur Scargill. CPGB in its current form then represent the Marxist-Leninist faction of the SLP, who found their party's support for the Imperialist Labour Party to be completely untenable. Moving towards the events of last year, the new ML group Red Fightback posted an article detailing their stance on LGBT oppression in Britain. A few months later, CPGB linked this article on their Twitter page, chastising them as fighting against reality itself. This happened around the same time that many LGBT members within the party, like Lewis Hodder, became increasingly unnerved by CPGB's strange attitude in regards to LGBT issues. One attitude Hodder makes of note is the use of casual homophobia within the Central Committee, including belittling of them, stating, "Oh, you're young. You'll realise when you get older that you'll want to have kids." So not just casual homophobia there, but complete dinosaur perspective, thinking that being queer separates you from the want to have children. Hodder later released an article of his experiences and analysis of the party last April in EP magazine. It's a good website, by the way, you should definitely give it a look. Now, all of the contradictions came together last September when CPGB had their 8th Congress, in which the Central Committee unanimously passed Motion 8, which details a complete rejection of identity politics in all forms, with those thought of promoting it liable to expulsion. Really getting down with the time there, guys. CPGB has a tendency of being a mountain of sorts. By that I don't mean a purveyor of knowledge, but more so that they uphold a line that's never really criticised or falters. Props for integrity. Pity you had to draw this into a dogma. Unfortunately, CPGB-ML only represents a mere example of a much wider issue of dismissing identity politics as inherently liberal or bourgeois. Being me, I'm no mass authority on this subject, so the following is not a work of me alone, but rather a paraphrasing of a much bigger set of works by a team of queer communists that have amassed some incredible insight that I certainly wouldn't have been able to bring to town on my own. They are the All-Communist Trans-Soviet. Their name, not mine. They've done an incredible amount of work, and the full articles, including the bibliography, are in the description. Hope you enjoy. Now, as I mentioned before, the whole crescendo began publicly with CPGB-ML sharing the Red Fightback article, and claims that they are showcasing that gender doesn't exist, and making it out that they believe in a grand medical conspiracy. And this is of course not the point of the RFP article, but it does let us ask the question, what is sex and gender? Video number 329. You can make the case that biology played a part in the modern division of labour among genders. What you can't say is that this is wholly a logical consequence of nature. It is not self-evident or common sense, a word these folks love to use by the way, that the division of labour between men and women, and indeed even the mere existence of those two categories, is natural. Even if it were, this is undialectical. Nothing is just so. It is all a product of what comes before and gives rise to what comes after. Basic stuff, right? It's been spoken about a lot on LeftTube by now, but I'll do it again. Traditional descriptors of gender are reductionist. We can say all we want, XX and XY determine your gender, but we all know that there are far more chromosomes than simply these two. If we were to determine by ability to get pregnant, or bleed, or what kind of genitals you have, then this is also too slim, because again, many cis women can't get pregnant or menstruate, and many people are born intersex. Now whatever it is, no matter what definitions you come up with, you'll always find plenty of examples in which such a definition is inconclusive. It is from this uncertainty that non-conforming folks have to defend their positions. If gender were indeed so clear, it would not in any way be necessary to have this such wide discussion. Worth bearing in mind, by the way, that the modern definitions of sex aren't historically unchallenged. We today purport a two-sex model, but as recently as 300 years ago, there was a one-sex model. This asserted that women were not a unique sex, but rather they were a deviation of men, defined by their lack of instead of their differences to. Only when the two-sex model appeared did science regard men and women in biological categories. Now, it's very strange that CPGB would not even question whether ruling class hegemony would ultimately reward purveyors of popular opinion, whilst demonizing unpopular narratives. They are, of course, communists. To uphold common sense, that's very un-Marxian. What too is highly non-Marxian, or just plain dogmatic, is to ignore modern insight in favour of old-fashioned perspectives that have now gone out of date. Anthropology has rendered ideas like Adam Smith's barter-to-money theory obsolete, and so too has anthropology made outdated much of what Engels spoke about in regards to the man being the inhibitor of productive labour. It was only towards the introduction of enclosure and privatization of property, and thereby into capital, that the dynamics began to radically change. Peasants, being in a different class interest to their feudal overlords, were resistant to these changes. What this resulted in was the ruling class dividing and conquering. A division was made between productive and reproductive labour, better said than me elsewhere. As of such, the only labour that was valued was productive labour, seeing as babies and housework creates no surplus for the economy. Of course, a concession is made only because reproduction is necessary towards humanity's survival. It is for this reason then that sexism under capitalism is inherent. It's not just a kindler, and it's upheld by the hegemony of the land, with this reproductive labour being used as maintenance for the productive labour of men. Women's work is thereby considered common sense. So, as we can already see, systemic gendering was an essential part of capitalism's primitive accumulation. And so where does the LGBT come into all this? Well, LGBT defy the gender roles not just in self-identification, but in material reality. In a gay relationship, if, according to capitalist whims, it necessitates that one of them defy the role of breadwinner or homemaker. In trans people, rejecting the role too, but specifically assigned to them at birth. It is creating a new synthesis of sorts, striking a direct blow to the ways in which we perceive gender roles in labour. This is of course parodied in the whole, the heteronormative capitalist patriarchy blah-de-blah, but I think if we look into this a bit deeper, we can see that there is a real genuine meaning behind that expression. Ask yourself, why does LGBT+ exist as a collective group anyway? It's because these groups present collective threat to the orthodox system that prevents consciousness. And as we can see then, women's oppression and the LGBT oppression are highly connected. It's only when this analysis within capitalism is omitted that they appear separate. So, with all this being said, what then of the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist? Point number 1. CPGB-ML are vulgar materialists. To quote Lewis Hodder, members of the party have praised realism, assuming that reference to what is real, i.e. material, fulfills the function of dialectical materialism itself. Yet, this does not come up against anything that actually exists, but merely seeks to replicate it and keep things as they are. In assuming that it has established a natural history, it looks at the end product of a development and seeks to maintain it on the pretense of fighting idealism. Assumptions like this are not tested, they are just assumed. This is the essence of vulgar materialism, and CPGB-ML is full of it. To quote the speaker of the article, it's quite clear who the writer of this is, by the way. Most probably it's Ranjit Brar, and if his likeness and name sound familiar, it's because he's the son of CPGB-ML founder Harpal Brar, and he's also the brother to current CPGB co-chair Josie Brar. Lots of Bras. Are sex and gender synonyms? Well, there are synonyms, Aunt Helga, but a certain group of academics in the 70s decided that they weren't synonyms, that they were going to use gender in their own way, that they were going to use gender to mean a social construct of behaviour surrounding what was expected of the biological differentiation amongst human beings. But biological differentiation between male and female is a real thing. It doesn't just exist in humanity, it exists in many species throughout the natural world. As is clear from the first half of this video, the Central Committee can't seem to wrap their heads around anything outside of the common sense views of sex and gender. Marxism is a way of thinking by which you can examine life. Just having read a load of books doesn't suddenly give you the green light to say whatever you want to say. People who espouse this sort of stuff, by the way, are, in a strange sense, sort of privileged. They can, with enough prodding, acknowledge the existence of LGBT people and their hardship, but they flatly refuse to do anything beyond that, and being fine with the current state of things and content with the promise of equality under socialism. But here lies the contradiction. If LGBT people aren't oppressed, then there's no need to be liberated by socialism. But if they are oppressed, then they are failing to do their duty in defending all people oppressed by capitalism. Not to mention that it's clear from looking at past socialist examples that this attitude is blinding, and nothing is necessarily guaranteed. New awakenings must be campaigned for, even in the here and now, and there's just no confidence spewing out of these guys' lips. If you insist that all that matters is class, and also insist that you're totes not queerphobic, I ask you the same question I asked to anti-feminist YouTubers. Why the need for such chide remarks? Why not just treat them like any other person? Why do you have to slip into this subtle chauvinism all the time, like you got some pathological intent towards doing so? It's clear that the Central Committee do not view them as the same, exemplified in their contrasting of LGBT people to ordinary people. Until the works of groups like LGSM during the 80s, most of the British Old Left, be they in parties or unions, tended to hold quite conservative views on LGBT issues. Could you imagine the kind of excuses that CPGB-ML would be coming up with if they were around 30 years back? The only reason that CPGB does the absolute bare minimum they can possible is because they have no other choice in the 21st century. Like I said, privileged. Point number 2. CPGB-ML are class reductionists. So back to that initial question. What is similar between Carl Benjamin and the CPGB-ML? They both appeal to a caricature of the working class. Carl likes to flaunt himself as a supporter of the working man, but only his particular kind of working man. 2 summers ago he chastised me on the basis that I'm a lame-o who lives off my parents, despite him previously sticking up for the working class in a video prior. I could have been straddled in debt, I could have been working minimum wage, and I was. But because I didn't fit his perception of what a working class person is, he rejects my perspective, as well as the perspectives of BME people and many other minorities. He will pay lip service to people on zero-hour contracts, but only when it's used to fight against leftists. Similarly then, CPGB-ML also fetishize an outdated caricature of the working class as if that were ever what it was to begin with. Exemplified in this horrendous PSA for its members where they literally tell them effectively how to dress and act working class. Including all the boys have to get an undercut. But Harple, what about Vicky? Sadly for the party, reducing themselves to this purely class politics outlook is neither true nor pragmatic. You will only ever achieve a certain amount of support, and indeed a certain demographic, on the basis of class politics alone. Why? Well, if you want a simple reason, because it's boring. In order for people to find their liberation, they must first find actualization, fulfillment, and connection of their struggles into the revolutionary movement. Despite funding their books with Mao's Little Red Book, the Black Panther Party knew that it would take their position as an oppressed nation in America to organize effectively and to help other people understand their place in the system. By comparison then, Bob Avakian goes around LARPing to crowds as the next Lenin, talking about situations that nobody cares about, and he gets booed at. Oddly enough, such an understanding has been staring at us in the face for hundreds of years. CPGB's insignia, like most others, is that of the hammer, for industrial workers, and the sickle, for agricultural peasantry, and maybe one more if you're Korean. Would it make sense to apply the same rhetoric that you do for workers as you would do for the peasantry, and vice versa? Lenin didn't. Remember that Brother Ho was but a mere Viet nationalist in 1919, but because of the Third International's theory on the right of self-determination, he found a shared necessity. Declarations don't convince people. Demonstrations do. CPGB-ML's insistence on this rugged worker stereotype invites the opinion that supporting LGBT issues would alienate the working class, but sees absolutely no problematic of upholding the image of Joseph Stalin to the British public. That's fine. Just don't talk about those people. More to the point here, is this resistance or a costume party? Either way, I think CPGB finds itself in contradiction again here, trying to challenge the misconceptions on the one hand, whilst upholding some of the most reactionary narratives on the other. Even going as far as to be naively receptive to fascist dog whistles and having a general red-brown alliance kind of undertone amongst their entire party. Oh, unfortunately I can't see this tweet, but this person, from what I remember, said something of the following. Their caricature ultimately sows the seeds for their own regression and downfall to begin with. By appealing to these metaphysical assumptions, they reject the grassroots practice needed to succeed, instead assuming that in time the working class will come to them, as a given. Point number 3. CPGB-ML's rejection of the intersection. Indeed, imperialism and colonialism has its own intersection with LGBT politics. When European nations grabbed huge portions of the earth, they imposed their own standards of beauty and behavior upon the populace. Historically, this included repression of native matriarchal social structures, sexual practice, and gender expressions. All deviations from standard Western norms are thereby not tolerated, and without question, this was a violent, compulsory, systemic cleansing of traditional beliefs and customs. But the CPGB-ML asserts the Western imperialist bourgeoisie has suddenly discovered and embraced gay and transgender rights, which only yesterday it had vigorously opposed. The advantage to the bourgeoisie of this new discovered enthusiasm for gay rights is that it can use them to castigate oppressed countries who stick to the traditional religious prejudices. Are these people silly? Have they not noticed the far greater legacy of imperialist nations castigating other nations that defy traditional heteronormativism? Blimey, that's a word. That the Saudi Arabian leadership is spared our unholy gay bourgeois wrath has everything to do with co-opting with the West from its very inception as a ruling class, not to do with the enthusiasm for gay rights that the ruling class has apparently been propagating since Stonewall. This enthusiasm reactionary narratives speak of, by the way, doesn't exist. It's surface-level window dressing created by elevating the preconception that LGBT rights are bourgeois into a principle, and applying that to their analysis of capitalism. From what we've spoken about so far, this should come as a big warning sign that rejecting intersectionality from socialist discourse creates a visibly retrograde outlook. There is not just the working class. We are a diverse group whose members face different kinds of oppression. It's still nurtured in the capitalist web, but it is directed along the lines of identity, something that CPGB-ML dearly misses. Whilst it is true that identity politics has a degree of bourgeois ideology attached to it, they get absolutely no brownie points for pointing this out, because it's already been acknowledged 1,000,000 times by socialist adherents. Seriously, do you think it's some sort of, big old slam dunk to point out the brocialists' gambit? The brocialist problem is that they take the polar opposite stance to the usual liberal idpolar. They miss that whilst the ideology might well be flawed, the reasons for its existence are very, very real. The great irony of dismissing identity politics on the basis of bourgeois ideology is that capital can be seen this way too. Surely, through the correct digging, we would find that the constructions of the bourgeoisie need to be acknowledged and worked through, not discarded on the altar of progress. Every time a movement fails to acknowledge this, it fails the masses. And it dooms CPGB's entire framework. They cannot simply say, black and white, unite and fight. They must first engage with their unique struggles directly. If you want a more fair critique of identity politics, I recommend reading the full transcript of this video or Hodder's article. I hope we've demonstrated that the real core problem with CPGB-ML is not that they march around with Stalin banners on May Day. I've been to the parade myself, and believe me, there's plenty of BME parties who do it. The problem with CPGB-ML is that in their attempt to fight back against propaganda, it's resulted in them becoming exactly what they've hated. Blind dogmatists who refuse to adapt to the changing times of society and the changing times of research. Lewis Hodder once again says it best themselves. When members have left out of frustration at the lack of self-criticism displayed within the party, or for that matter, even their own health, there has been a dismissive air that says, well, if you're not willing to help now, how useful will you be when things get more difficult? Yet this same logic can be applied to the party as a whole. If they are unwilling to undergo self-criticism now, how likely will they, when the party grows, should it become a force in British politics? Will it become increasingly vulgar and attack its own party members even when they are abiding by democratic centralism? Will it continue to ignore theory in order to position itself as the only Marxist-Leninist party in Britain? CPGB showcased that they are either A, ignorant of the facts and unwilling to do the research, or B, hold resentment to queer people, many of whom are working class, specifically by modes of capitalist oppression. I don't care. Both of these answers render CPGB-ML unable to represent the masses, and thus unfit to call themselves the party of the proletariat. If there is any hope for CPGB-ML to recover from this in any way, its only option in my mind would be to, ironically, have a cultural revolution of sorts. Open the doors of the Central Committee to let the masses in and eventually wither away the old elements of the party. Oh, a man can dream. It is our duty to stand with all oppressed parties, to vigorously defend their struggles and to bring their plight to the forefront of action we take. This is the only way that we can build the trust needed for the formation of a revolutionary mass, and finally bring about the overthrow of the system that exploits us all, not fall into dogma. When we say that Marxism is correct, it is certainly not because Marx was a prophet, but because his theory has been proved correct in our practice and in our struggle. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and do go and support the all-communist trans Soviet. Bye for now.